Have you ever had a vision so strong that it would be exactly how you wanted it to in the final result? Sure, it would evolve and change over time, but everything does. Your vision was such that you knew exactly what you were doing. And this is what this model is about. I had envisioned this from the beginning, and I'm so glad I could finally bring it to life. Philosophically rich and detailed intro aside, this video is going to be about my journey painting this model. I had made it myself, and I'm going to show you how I made it look all spiffy and animated. This is not a tutorial, it is just my journey. Now let's get into it. Before anything gets painted, we first need to block in everything underneath and all the undercoat colors. This will be the baseline that we're working with, just so we can block out everything and see how we want to continue. Without this step, we'll essentially just be making it up as we go along. Not that there's anything wrong with that, it just leads to a more chaotic process. Since this is such a chaotic model, I decided that the paint job couldn't be too ostentatious. Sure, it needed to fit into the world and all the other models it has been painted in, which does mean some exaggeration, but you don't want to overcrowd the visuals and just make it difficult to look at. For this reason, I've chosen purple, black, and yellow as my main colors, with a few others as support. Once all the main colors are down, you'll need to start adding some of the supporting colors. For instance, you'll see me blocking in a lot of the metallic parts now, and what this is going to do is it'll give a sense of separation between the bigger colors so that it's not too monochrome. It'll also allow us to add a different material all around so that it's not just all matte or all shiny. Don't be afraid to experiment a little bit, because you'll never know if you like something unless you see it with your own eyes. But I've kept you all waiting long enough. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of this video. I'm going to begin by painting the cockpit. I want it to look like glass, so a nice blue is in order. And I want to have a really long gradient because it's going to be right in front of the model and a different color than almost everything else. This will be achieved by painting the model but leaving the recesses as its original dark color. What this is going to do is it's going to trick the eye into thinking there's light shining upon the model and highlighting the tops of it. Because it's the focal point, I am going to add more colors than I otherwise would have, just to make it pop an extra bit more. Our glass is looking great, so let's move on to the next color. While painting this purple, I thought I'd go all wild and pink and vibrant, but I found that it just looked too distracting. Like I said before, you sometimes just need to keep it simple. I even tried inverting the colors, like some sort of metallic highlight. Unfortunately, it just made it worse. So you'll just have to stare at it as I continue to wait for it to grow on me, only for me to eventually give up. Our next color is going to be a bit more subtle. I wanted the hull and other parts of the model to be black, just so that our eyes can rest and find refuge from all the bright and pointy bits on this model. The bottom of the model isn't that important anyway, so it's not like most of our hard work's going to get covered up. When painting with black, it's important to choose the right highlight color. If you just increase the saturation, you'll just get different variations of grey until you get to white. This is great if you want a more muted color scheme, but that's not quite what we're going for. You'll see me here going for a very desaturated blue. What this is going to do is it's going to add some sort of cooler tone to the black, as opposed to just a more desaturated look. I still wasn't quite happy with how it was looking, so I tried to smoothen out the color for a bit, which seemed to destroy my PC and tank my frame rate. Eventually I just added a very opaque layer of black, kind of like a wash, all over it, just to mute the colors a little bit. It was at this time that I finally decided that the bright pink was just not working. What I did instead was just use the original dark color and increase the saturation bit by bit until I was happy with it. Sometimes you just don't need to overcomplicate things. If you're anything like me, You'll get to a stage in the creative process where you'll step back and think, yeah, I don't need to add any other colors. It looks good. But that feeling will niggle at you. It'll feast on you from the inside until eventually you decide, okay, I'll see what it looks like with another highlight color. What usually follows next is some variation of, damn, that looks good. Why does it have to look good? While I'm lamenting the last hours I spent on this, let's just move on to the last part of this hull, the little metal bit. Because we're going for a more metallic color, we're going to have to invert our highlighting process. Starting from a lighter color at the edges and working our way to the darker color in the middle. We want to try and trick the eye into thinking that the edges are catching the light and shining off of it. So it just makes us think it's metal. And while we've got the metal out, we may as well do up the little spiky bits as well. Just making sure it looks nice and shiny and all that. For the feet especially, you'd want to make great use of the mirror tool, or else you'll end up wasting a long time on just doing bare highlights. Next, we'll have a look at those legs. More specifically, I wanted to pair up black and gold together because I just really like how they look. Because we are trying to paint gold, we need to add our highlights really close to each other to make it look quite shiny, as opposed to, say, the glass where we had more of a gradient. Eagle-eyed viewers may have been able to spot the subtle square spot which doesn't seem to want to take paint. This seems to happen when your UVs aren't quite mapped out correctly. I did, despite my best efforts, try and fix this. However, I ended up just working around it. Lastly, you just want to go into the properties menu and make it actually shiny, not just fake highlighted shiny like what we've been doing. To finish off the legs, we'll add the same black highlights that we did to the hull, and also add some grey just to break it up a bit and follow the geometry, using the same highlighting process as the other metals we've been using. Next, we'll move on to a part that I like to call the hull connector, for reasons. We can afford to use brighter colors here because there isn't as much geometry and there's less risk of the eye being overwhelmed. We do also want to draw attention to this just so that none of the model goes unnoticed. That brings us neatly to the middle of the model, the second hull, where we're just going to touch up the trim like we did the first time. While we've got the purple out, we're just going to do up the vent. We're just going to follow the geometry real simply because I personally like it when my textures support my geometry and not the other way around, although there's nothing wrong with it. While we admire the great job that we've just done and are patting ourselves on the back, we can look for our next target, namely the fan. It's important when painting to remember what these things actually do. For instance, you wouldn't find paint on an actual fan blades because the torque would probably just rip the paint off. So you can just leave that as bare metal. I did run into a slight issue here. As it turns out, I had forgotten to UV unwrap one of the fans. No matter, I'll just erase what I've done, copy the UVs from the working fan onto the broken one, and then just continue on with the project. Finally, I'll just add some highlights to the metally fan part of, well, the fan, and we can move on to our next section. While I'm cruising around the model looking for my next target, I notice something odd. It seems like the vent has gone and unpainted itself, which is just fantastic. Now that that's done, again, we can move on to some of the other parts of this model, like the pipes. A lot of these are the same techniques as you've seen before, especially with this purple pipe. The only thing I really have to say on it that is different this time is that I just wanted to make sure it looks like it's part of the frame and holding everything in place, just so it's nice and sturdy and looks appealing. As for the yellow, just remember to paint all around and not just most of it. We dive back into the black paints just to paint the hull and also that top bit before we dive back into the metal, where we are going to simply do what we've already been doing. So honestly, not that much more interesting. So you just start with a dark color in the recesses, highlight up to a lighter color until eventually you get to the tips where you apply your brightest highlights where the light will touch it. I was a bit messy while applying the paints, so after cleaning it up I had noticed some squares that looked a bit odd from everything else. What I hadn't noticed is during the material properties phase, I'd forgotten to select them, so they're using the same color as the black around it, but are just as shiny as the metal. So all I had to do is go back and select them again. Now we have yet more black paint, strategically placed to again relieve the eyes. It's very important that you nail these spots and where you put them. But other than that, it's the same as before. Black base coat, blue on top, lighter blue on top of that light blue, and a black wash over it all. Stop me if you've heard this before, but to get our purple we want, we start with a darker color, we put lighter color on top of it, we put the even lighter color on top of that color, avoid some of the flatter panels because it's an organic shape, and we've got a lovely purple. Lastly, we've got the metal. Same story as before, start dark, go light. This has been getting a bit repetitive for a while now, so why don't we just rapid fire through some of the things. We're going to go to the gun, paint some black, paint some metal, paint some purple. For some reason, the rings here don't want to take paint super well, so I had to paint that manually in the UV editor. This is looking good, so let's keep going. You ready? We add some yellow. It's a bit hard to reach in some places, so take your time. Paint some purple highlights, and remember to avoid the large flat areas with your organic shapes. Just in time for you to have another UV editing problem. And to cap it all off, we can paint up the rims once again. We're going to slow down a little bit here. These cables are connected to the guns, which will hopefully smite our enemies to kingdom come. I'm painting them blue, same blue as the cockpit, but different because I'm not going to be shading them as much or making them as shiny. The purpose in doing this is to bring some balance to the model with having the blue at the front and the back. Our good friend UV mapping won't leave me quite yet, however, because for some reason two of these pipes don't want to copy the UV data like the rest. So I had to go and paint the highlights over again. Now we can admire our paint job, get ready to move to the next step, and then stop because you forgot to paint the headlights. Same as before, start dark at the back, progressively highlight at the front, but it's different from the gold because it has an emission property. Right, painting's done, but we can't just leave a fancy model like this hanging. So we're going to animate it. I'll begin by adding a hook modifier to the hull connector, so that it'll deform as the model turns. The first shot of the animation is what the viewer is going to see first, so it has to be one of your best foots forward. In my case, I wanted to zoom into a dynamic part of the model by these fans. The idea is to have them start up spinning and get the viewer interested as they see the camera slowly zoom out and reveal the rest of the model. As funny as it would be having these fans get jiggy with it being the first thing that the viewer sees, it's not really what I'm going for. So I tried a few different methods to get rid of it. Namely, I tried rotating it on its local axis, but for some reason it just wouldn't do that in the animation. Tried a few other things, confirming its position, adding a new empty to control it with, but nothing seemed to work. So I simply just removed the offset. And here comes the fun part. We're going to get the legs to move. After putting it in forward gear, I suppose, we're going to add a reference for the ground so that we know exactly how to rig our suspension. And when I say suspension, I mean two things. The suspension of our actual vehicle and the suspension of disbelief. It may seem like a trivial thing, but such an unrealistic model needs to have something that grounds it in reality, or else the viewer will never take it seriously. One way to do this is to think about how the vehicle will interact with the environment around it and react to certain things, like starting up or bouncing on the ground or coming to a stop. Having the entire model bounce up and down isn't really what we want. We want it to bounce in the beginning, but as the legs move at high speed, we want to have the model itself stop moving. But that's where the suspension comes in. The idea is to have the model bounce a lot at the beginning, and then less and less as it gains speed, but the suspension takes more and more of the slack. And then as it comes to a stop, the reverse is true. It slowly begins bouncing again until eventually coming to a halt. To come to a halt, first you need to have some fun. Then you need to make sure everything is parented to the chassis so it doesn't go off all wonky. And then finally you can have it tilt forward, stay there for a brief moment, and then come back. For our next scene, we want the model to turn. That's why we added the hook modifier earlier. To observe this, we need the camera to be in a bird's eye view so it could better see the maneuver. To pull off said maneuver, it's quite easy. We just need the whole model to rotate, and then we'll rotate each hull individually and make sure that the hull connector doesn't, disconnect from the hull. Now the model doesn't necessarily look static, but it could be more lively. So I'm going to animate the vent. This is done by just having it bounce up and down really quickly and then just extending that throughout the entire animation. I'm just going to spend a lot of time, making sure the bouncing looks good and just refining it to a point where it doesn't look as goofy as it does now. Finally, we can remove the floor, do some last minute camera adjustments, take a cheeky screenshot for later, and now it's on to the glamour shots. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed. This was a lot of fun for me to do, and just let me know if you want me to see more of this in future by liking and subscribing. Thank you.